Debate, reprise de débat. The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We're here today debating a tax bill, and I would begin by observing that our federal government is faced with a very serious revenue problem. The Conservative members of this House like to pat themselves on the back for the fact that federal tax revenues as a share of gross domestic product are at their lowest level in about half a century. And they're free to applaud that. Thanks very much. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that we don't have enough resources to fund important public services and necessary infrastructure. So that's one of the main reasons that we have a big federal deficit. And it is important that if we want to live in a civilized society, we need to have ways of raising the revenue to pay for those services and those infrastructures that we depend on. So what has the government done in terms of generating that needed revenue? Well, Bill C-2 proposes an additional 4 percentage points of personal income tax on incomes over $200,000 per year. And that's definitely a positive initiative, Madam Speaker, but it's also a fairly minor initiative. It doesn't actually raise very much revenue. In fact, it doesn't even raise enough revenue to pay for the so-called middle-class tax cut that actually goes to what we might call the upper middle class. The maximum benefit is only to people earning more than $90,000 a year. So we have this kind of redistribution from the rich to the nearly rich, which is costing the Treasury even more money. We in the NDP have suggested that the government might look to the corporate sector as a source of additional revenues to pay for public services. And it's interesting that just this morning, the Toronto Star and CBC are out with a joint investigation that looks into the loss of revenue to offshore tax havens. And what it notes is that all of these tax information exchange agreements that the former Conservative government was very keen to sign have actually made the problem worse. The goal of these agreements was obviously to achieve greater transparency, to get more information about what was going on in tax havens. But what the Conservatives did while they were in power is to put in place a policy whereby once a country had signed one of these tax information exchange agreements, there was no more enforcement. Canadian companies could just repatriate profits tax-free from those jurisdictions. So far from curtailing offshore tax avoidance, this sort of plethora of tax information exchange agreements has actually made the problem worse, and I think that's a problem that we need to be addressing in this House, Madam Speaker. Now, I would also like to talk a little bit about a specific case of offshore tax avoidance that I think really illustrates the problem. So Cameco is a company that mines uranium in Saskatchewan, and in 1999 it signed a deal with its own subsidiary in Zug, Switzerland, to sell that uranium to Switzerland at a fixed price of $10 per pound. Now, Switzerland wasn't the ultimate destination or user of that uranium. The subsidiary in Zug was just reselling it to other jurisdictions around the world at market prices. And of course, the market price of uranium is variable, but it's consistently been quite a bit more than $10 a pound. It's currently around $30 a pound. It was up as high as $140 a pound back in 2007. So the only real effect of this arrangement was to transfer billions of dollars of profits from Canada to this Swiss tax haven. The Canada Revenue Agency has calculated that from 2003 through 2015, that cost the governments of Canada and Saskatchewan more than $2 billion in lost tax revenue. So this is a huge scandal, Madam Speaker. It first came out in 2013. At that time, I was struck by the fact that Saskatchewan's Conservative and one Liberal MP were totally silent on the matter. Fortunately, we now have some new Democratic MPs from the province who are going to speak up for tax fairness and raise issues like this. So it's very concerning that we have this company that's making huge profits off off of Canadian resources and then transferring those profits out of the country in a very brazen way in order to avoid paying tax on them. So the good news here, Madam Speaker, is that the Canada Revenue Agency has started to pursue this matter. That's the way in which it came out publicly in 2013. But the news that is a little bit more concerning is that there's been a real tradition of both Conservative and Liberal governments not actually following through on these cases and instead kind of signing these deals that let the tax cheats off the hook. So part of the reason that I want to bring forward the Cameco case in this House is to put it on record, is to make sure that the Government of Canada is actually going to follow up on this and is not going to just let the company get away with this scam. And I'm not alone in this, Madam Speaker. Earlier this week, an organization called Canadians for Tax Fairness presented a petition signed by more than 36,000 people calling on Cameco to make these tax payments. So there are a lot of people that are concerned about this, and finally they have some Saskatchewan voices in Parliament speaking up for them. And I would also like to touch on the provincial side of this whole question, because of course the tax base to which provincial taxes apply is actually defined by the Government of Canada. So when you have a company like Cameco shifting taxable profits out of the country, it's not just the federal government that loses out, it's also the government of Saskatchewan that's no longer able to collect the appropriate taxes on that money. And this is a really pressing concern because, of course, the government of Saskatchewan is running a huge deficit right now. The government of Saskatchewan really needs that money to maintain important public programs in our province. So this is kind of a critical issue, and it's just come to light recently. The kind of small C Conservative government in Saskatchewan refused to present a budget prior to the recent provincial election because, of course, they wanted to kind of conceal the fact that they were running this big deficit. But, Madam Speaker, now we know that there's a huge deficit there, and we know how important it would be for the province of Saskatchewan to be able to collect fair corporate taxes from the profits generated off of our province's resources. And it's not just about Cameco. This point is applicable to the whole question of offshore tax avoidance. If the federal government were to do a better job of preventing this tax avoidance and tax evasion and actually making sure that the correct amount of profits were subject to federal corporate income tax, that would also mean those same profits could be subject to provincial corporate income tax. So, I think almost all provincial governments are in deficit right now, and one of the best things that this Parliament could do to help our provincial governments to generate the revenues that they need for health care and education and social services would be to get our tax system in order and make sure that appropriate reporting is being done so that not only do we have adequate revenues for the federal government, but so that our provincial counterparts can fund their operations in an appropriate way as well.
Good idea.
So, Madam Speaker, we're facing a huge revenue problem in this country. We've got tax rates down at these historic lows, which just aren't sufficient to fund the important services and the necessary infrastructure on which Canadians rely. Why is this happening? Well, obviously, one of the problems is that the general corporate tax rate has been cut, and as my colleague pointed out, that's led to a huge loss of revenue and hasn't actually produced investment in our economy. But the other issue is that whatever the tax rate is, it's not actually being applied because of these offshore tax schemes, which were aggravated by the recent Conservative government, and of which Cameco in Saskatchewan is a particularly egregious example. So, Madam Speaker, we need to focus on this problem and come up with concrete solutions to collect appropriate revenues. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
and over $200,000 income, I think was not supposed to be, was supposed to be to raise votes, not to raise revenue. Does the honourable member agree to that?
Member for Regina Lewvan.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I mean, as I said in my speech, I do believe that this modest tax increase for the very wealthiest Canadians is a good and desirable policy, and it will raise some needed revenue. So I certainly think it makes sense. Where I think I would agree with the member for Edmonton Manning is that it won't actually raise very much revenue. In fact, it will raise significantly less money than the Liberal government is going to give away through this so-called middle-class tax cut that doesn't actually go to the middle class. So if we're serious about raising revenue, we need to look at the corporate side of the ledger and start reversing corporate tax cuts as well as closing loopholes and dealing with these offshore tax havens. Thanks for the question.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thanks, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to applaud
my
colleague for an excellent speech and of course, his deep knowledge in this area of tax and revenue. I was just wondering if he could expand on his comments concerning the so-called middle-class tax cut. Just wondering if he could expand on why the title doesn't actually match the measures that are being put forward by the government. Thank you.
The honourable member for Regina Lewvan.
Well, I thank the member for Burnaby South for the excellent question. I think on the Liberal side of this House there might have been some confusion between a middle-class tax cut and the middle tax bracket. What the government has done is to cut the middle bracket, which actually only applies to incomes in excess of $45,000. And it goes all the way up to incomes of $90,000. So, Madam Speaker, to receive the maximum benefit from this supposed middle-class tax cut, one would need to be earning an income of more than $90,000 a year, which I believe most Canadians would consider to be certainly the upper middle class. So that's the reason I don't think that the title middle-class tax cut is very accurate. Thanks.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I would totally disagree with the member. This middle-class tax cut is going to provide tax relief to over 9 million Canadians, hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about farmers, teachers, all sorts of professions, Madam Speaker. And my question to the member is, why does this member choose, or the NDP choose, to disagree and allow for Canada's middle class, those teachers and manufacturer workers, that hard-working middle class, to have a tax break?
Very brief answer from the member from Regina Lewvan, and he would still have about a minute and a half to after the next time he speaks on this.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I mean, if 9 million Canadians are getting some benefit from the tax change, that means that 20-odd million Canadians are getting no benefit at all. And, of course, many of those 9 million Canadians aren't receiving much benefit at all. And I look forward to debating this matter again after question period. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
In a minute and 30 seconds, if the honourable member for Fort Saskatchewan, Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, can ask a very brief question, I'm sure we can have a very brief answer for the member for Regina Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I always so enjoy asking questions to my friend from Regina Lewvan. Now, we heard his perspective on economic policy, but I would encourage him to look not just at economic theory, but at economic history. He's from Saskatchewan, I'm from Alberta. I think both of us suffer from provincial government envy to some extent, but for decades, under NDP governments in Saskatchewan, pursuing policies that he advocates of bigger government, bigger spending, capital, and more importantly, people left Saskatchewan for Alberta. But now, under the Wall government, the exodus of young people from Saskatchewan has stopped. Doesn't that member have to agree that the policies of free enterprise that are now being pursued in Saskatchewan are better, have led to more young people staying in Saskatchewan and be able to get employed there?
Honourable member for Regina Lewvan.
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't have to agree. In fact, I would note that there are many other differences between the two provinces. For example, the Canadian oil industry really started out in Saskatchewan. It was the discovery of a huge reserve of oil at Leduc in 1947 that caused that industry to shift to Alberta. That wasn't about government policy. That was about geology. Also, we see now with the downturn in commodity prices that both Alberta and Saskatchewan have been hit with layoffs and with cuts in investment, and right-wing policies at the provincial level in Saskatchewan certainly have not saved our province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All within a minute and a half. I'm very impressed.